Well, it's 11:35 and keen to keep on time here. Welcome back, everyone, and welcome also to a few people I see have joined us since the start of our CECAN conference today, entitled "New Government, New Approach to Evaluation?" Looking at any thoughts and questions we may have around that. Special thank you to Lucy Moore from the Evaluation Task Force for a great opening session, and to all of you for contributing some excellent questions. My name is Paul Brand. I'm an evaluation practitioner and a facilitator. I've been associated with CECAN since its inception, working with a lot of them, their public workshops and so forth. And it's going to be my pleasure to welcome Tim Sunderland from Natural England as our next speaker. Tim's someone I know well. He's a principal specialist in economic innovation in Natural England's Chief Scientist Directorate, and is particularly passionate about improving public policy and decision making through better use of evidence, and in particular by making evidence more accessible to decision makers through pragmatic and effective decision support tools. He has an interest in strategic planning, progress indicators, capturing contemporary concerns, particularly around well-being, economy, environmental sustainability, and building physical limitations and subjective well-being into decision making, as opposed to it being, an add-on at the end. And he's currently working on a framework for local authorities called Explore, encompassing some of those aspects, and the impact from the Natural Capital Report. Outside of that, Tim has also worked in policy lobbying, fundraising, gives him a broad appreciation for the way decisions are made in the real world, and the role which evidence does, or perhaps does not always, play in that. Tim's going to talk to us for about 25 minutes on the gap between evaluation and appraisal, something CECAN's become very conscious of very early in their work, and so I'm really looking forward to the talk. Before I hand over to Tim, just a reminder, as Tim is speaking, you're welcome to put in any questions in the Q&A box. You'll find the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you can add those during Tim's talk. And then if you see a question that you think does need answering, then you can upvote it. And when Tim's finished giving us his thoughts, I'll lead us through a discussion, and I'll start with the questions which have the most upvotes. So I see you've got your slides up, Tim. Over to you.
So, can you hear me okay, Paul? Yeah, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for having me along, and thank you to Paul for that introduction. Um, I'm it's worth saying I'm not an evaluation practitioner or an evaluation specialist. I'm an economist. And from that, I've got interested in appraisal and then into evaluation. So I'm really grateful to CECAN for having me along to give a different perspective. And it's really good to have cross-disciplinary conversations. So what I'm going to offer today is some things that I've observed and then sort of an intuition I have, which I would like to test with you. And I'm sure some of the people on the call are much closer to some of the details. So I'm very happy to be corrected or have conversations as we go through on what I'm sharing. I'm going to start with a bit of big picture philosophy, and then I'm going to get into some recommendations for how we might close this gap between evaluation and appraisal. Most of those suggestions come from the philosophy, but some of them maybe are just things that I've picked up along the way. And some of them I'm aware actually are already in train. So some of the things that I see that need doing, once I start talking to experts in the field, they say we recognise that and that's already happening. So I'm very grateful to my colleagues in Natural England for talking about this with me. But any mistakes are mine. This is very much a personal perspective. So that'll do for an intro. I think most people on this call are really familiar with this, but I don't want to leave anyone behind. So I'm going to talk a lot about complexity sensitivity during this talk, and I don't want that to be confusing to people. So I like this model that I found from Dan Snowden. It's basically saying some things are really obvious. Everyone agrees what needs to be done, no problem. You plan it, you do it, it works out as expected. Some things, much more complicated, you need experts to work out what's going to happen. But you having got all the right experts together, you still think that you can predict what's going to happen fairly effectively. Genuinely complex things, you do need to work with lots of experts. And you do need to try to understand what you think will happen. But actually, it's sufficiently complex that you won't always get it right. And so you need to monitor the thing as you go. So a very important point for both appraisal and evaluation is dealing with complexity, which is something I'm going to pick up on as we go through. So this is the ROMEF cycle, probably familiar to many of you. Rationale through to objectives, appraisal, monitoring, evaluation, and feedback. I think most people recognize this doesn't work as well in practice as we would like it to, or at least I think almost everybody would accept there was room for improvement. And I want to get into why that might be. So I think often evaluation and appraisal are coming from really quite different places. And I'm going to explain in a moment why that is. But I think there's a gap, not just in practice, but in worldviews often between evaluation and appraisal that makes it difficult for them to pick up on the work that each other's doing. So here I'm going to borrow some philosophy from a guy at an Oxford college called Ian McGilchrist, who's a neuropsychiatrist, I think. And what he's saying is very interesting the way mammal brains work and human brains, which is that we have a right brain and a left brain, and they largely operate separately. So there's a big disconnect. They do connect, but it's not one system. There's two systems going on inside the brain. The left brain is about action, and it's about narrow focused attention. So in this picture, you've got a bird. It wants to get the food from between the grit or pebbles. So it needs narrow focused attention to do that. And it will be using its left brain to do that. But if it only does that, then it's going to be lunch. So it also needs the right brain to have this broader, big picture understanding of everything that's going on around it. And human brains work like that too. And then a bit more detail, which is that the right brain tends to focus on broad awareness. It deals with an embodied world, so the kind of immediate world that we're dealing with, and it is very relational, so it's very sensitive to relationships between things. The left brain is focused on gripping things, action. It's much more abstract and it's much more mechanical. Now, McGilchrist's big point is that the left brain should be in service of the right brain, and that when things are working best, the action we take is in service of this wider worldview that we have, bigger understanding of the world, but that actually that doesn't happen, and we end up in a left brain dominant situation. So if you're rock climbing, then if you've got a good grip, that's really helpful. But what's really dangerous is to think you've got a good grip and then find you don't. And we have a similar problem with numbers. So there's this story about a kid who walks into a museum and he says to the security guard, "How old is that dinosaur?" And the security guard says, "Oh, it's 3 billion years old and 3 weeks." And the kid says, "Oh, that's very specific. How do you know the exact age of the dinosaur?" And the security guard says, "Well, I started 3 weeks ago. And at that point, they said he was 3 billion years old." Now, that's a stupid example, but actually, I see people using numbers in a spuriously specific way very often. So it's a very easy trap to fall into with numbers. It's to give spurious accuracy. My son is a huge fan of this guy who writes the What If books, and he likes to give serious scientific answers to really stupid questions. And one of the really stupid questions was, what happens if you try to fit Niagara Falls through a straw? Actually, you can't do that. That wouldn't work. But he comes up with this graph that says, well, we would anger 5 committees, but destroy 1 planet. And then one of those stick people is saying, oh, the first bar is much bigger. Let's worry about that one. Let's worry about the committees. So this, I think, is some of the risk of missing the point that we can get sucked into with an overly quantitative perspective, which I think is connected to an overly left brain perspective. And then here is, I haven't got time to go into this in great detail, but here's a spectrum of decision-making tools that go from the very qualitative, so storytelling, pictures, maps, right through to the fully quantitative, which is kind of private sector cost-benefit analysis. And I think the most interesting stuff is in the middle, where we're using quantitative and qualitative together. And I don't think there's enough thought about that academically. So the business cases that we would use in a Treasury 5-case business case, that's a multi-criteria analysis. And there are elements of multi-criteria analysis within that. So I think it's very interesting to think across this spectrum, what are the right tools for dealing with what we're trying to do here? So this is like to come back to my split between appraisal and evaluation, I would say that appraisal is generally less complexity sensitive. Now, I know some people are working on this, so there is some work about complexity sensitivity and appraisal, but it's generally the exception. It's not the default approach in appraisal. It tends to come from an economics or similar kind of perspective, and it tends to be quite left brain orientated. So about action and about numbers. Evaluation is often more complexity sensitive, but not always. Often it comes from a social science perspective or a government social research perspective, but not always. And I think it can be a bit less left brain, as in a bit less focused on numbers and reduced simplified systems. But I think it's still quite left brain sometimes. So I think this gives us this worldview gap where we may not always understand each other to make the connections we want to make. So that was the philosophy bit. I now want to go into some suggestions for which might help, many of which come from this philosophy, but some of which just come from observations. And I'm aware that some of these are already in train. I'm going to cover them quite quickly, and then any you're interested in, you can come back to in the questions. Oh, and before I do that, I want to say that this is not a kind of simple case of qualitative good, quantitative bad, or complexity good, simple bad. Actually, the decision makers need to make decisions with limited resources. So there's something inherently quantitative about what the decision maker is doing. They need to think about value for money. So there's something inherently quantitative there. And they also need to be able to justify their decisions in public. So it's not right brain or left brain. We need to use both in the right way. And it's not qualitative or quantitative. It's about how we join up both together. So here's the recommendations bit. So I'm really interested in the systems maps work that CECAN has done. And one of my projects is using simplified systems maps. There seems to be two things you can do with that. One is the kind of activity of trying to understand the space that you're operating in, the policy space. It's very much a right brain kind of thing to do. But then there's an interesting paper about how do you bring that into decision making? And one answer would be to focus the map around a decision and then focus on what's material to that decision. The thing to avoid is to getting trapped in trying to understand everything. And so the proportionality thing that came up earlier is really important here. I'm then interested in how you can produce good enough or even better than nothing systems maps quite quickly. It's often a very involved process. And then I think if we want it to influence decision making, an important next step is guidance for how to connect the systems maps to the appraisal process and specifically the strategic and economic cases. So there will be moments where bits of that map need to be quantified, but again, I would be cautious about spurious accuracy. I can't see my title on this because of Zoom, but that's okay. So I think we're talking about appraisal here. I'm keen for the appraisal to start from evaluation. Now, there are a few lines in the Green Book that encourage that, but largely, I think the Green Book guidance encourages you to think about evaluating what you're doing, not so much about how to learn from evaluation that's already happened. I know there's a bit in there, but we could do more to encourage people with that. We could do with more emphasis in the Green Book, I think, on the logical framework, which would make the connection to the theory of change work in evaluation. So there is something in there about being clear about the cause and effect of what you're doing, but I think that could be stronger. It would be helpful to think about appraisal as an intervention in a system. What's the system that you're intervening in, and how do you think your intervention will help, rather than just delivery of a thing? Some things that are happening already, which I think are really helpful and we should build on. There's a shift towards a focus on the strategic case out of the Treasury 5 case model, which I think is really helpful because that's more complexity sensitive. There's also an increasing recognition that it's legitimate to use cost effectiveness analysis rather than cost benefit analysis in some instances. And there's some interesting work going on about using risk opportunity analysis, which is an extended multi-criteria decision analysis. The issue there is that if you're dealing with anything that's at a very large scale or transformational, cost benefit analysis tends to be conservative with a small c. and therefore may not capture the full value of what you're doing. I'll move on. So in terms of evaluation, now I recognize here I'm talking to experts and I'm not an expert, but I'm going to risk making a few comments. So I'm really keen for evaluation to start from the appraisal, and to use the work that was done in the appraisal in the evaluation. I'm keen also to engage with the counterfactual, which is what would have happened anyway, and engage with the appraisal's counterfactual, at least to the extent of saying we'll use it unless there's a good reason that we think it's inappropriate, and making the case why it would be inappropriate. And then the generalization is really important. So did this project succeed for very specific local reasons that aren't generalizable? Or could we generalize this across the country? This is really, really important. I think a challenge in evaluation is the broad scope, because evaluation is actually at least four things. It's more difficult to work out exactly what's proportionate. So evaluation can be used for in-flight improvement, improving the project while it's getting delivered. That's a really important role. It can be used for accountability to make sure people are doing a good job. Definitely getting used for learning for the future. And then it can be used in a kind of pre-appraisal kind of way to inform the appraisal and development. So those are all important roles, but separating them out a bit and working out what's proportionate is important. Some risks, I think, that there has been an increase in support and activity around evaluation in government in recent years, which I'm really supportive of. There are some risks to that. One risk is a kind of bureaucratization and commodification. So the kind of, right, you have to have a theory of change. So people put a few hours aside in the afternoon, they've done the theory of change, that's great, now they can file it. But they're not really going to use it because they've done it because they had to do it, rather because they could actually see the benefit of it. And there is also therefore a danger of contractors encouraging work that's not proportionate. I think there's a real danger with theory of change, which is a bit like spurious accuracy, which is that by the time you've mapped it all out on a piece of paper, you think you've got it all. So I think it's very important that theory of change flag the uncertainties in there. Often I think I'm dealing with a hunch of change rather than a theory, and we ought to just acknowledge that. So systematically, some of this was mentioned this morning already, which is great, but I think policy consistency, so it's helpful when you can get it, but also just acknowledging the policy consistency. I think sometimes we change the labels on things, but what we're actually trying to do is quite similar. So to spot the connections and make sure we can learn from the past. Something that helps with that is connections to longer term smart targets, by which I mean specific, measurable, achievable, all that stuff. Because that helps you to make the connection. And there's something in my local authority work about making connections to exactly those targets. The Barber review of best practice in government says it's really good to test the uncertainties publicly. So where there are groups of experts or interested parties outside government, very good to have those conversations. And then I was pleased to see what work centres come up already this morning. And I think they play a really essential role in closing the gap between evaluation and appraisal, because the evaluation's learning needs pulling together for the appraisal person to use it. Otherwise, it may be overwhelming. And I think there are probably therefore gaps in the what work centres that we would other what work centres we would like to see. So I'm going to cheekily suggest that CECAN needs to broaden its mission. So Centre for the Evaluation of Complexity Across the Nexus is great. I'm really keen to think about how complexity can be best handled in policy, appraisal, and evaluation. So I have no idea what acronym you would come up with for that. But I'll leave that to people who are better at acronyms than me. And then I wonder if there is a case for a new government profession. So we've already had conversations this morning about whether evaluation should be a profession. I wonder if we need a joint profession between evaluation and appraisal. We could call it the E&A profession. I think at the moment, evaluation is seen as connected to social science, which is a good thing. and appraisal is seen as connected to economics. But I think that does give a different in perspective, a difference in worldview. I think if we had a single profession, that would ensure a connection, which is often not made. And I think really strongly that would mm, not force, but strongly support people doing appraisal of projects to make sure they were learning from what had happened already, because if you like, that would be part of their job title. I think it would help to cultivate pragmatism about proportionality, materiality, and that those are difficult issues to get right. So I think a profession around that would help to deal with that. I think it would really support best practice and learning from experience, and it would draw on other professions as necessary. And social sciences, economics are obvious ones, but project management and the risk profession are two more that are important that I highlighted. Another one that springs to mind might be operational research at times. And that was what I wanted to say. So I'm now open to questions.
So, as Stuart did before, whilst we just allow a few minutes for people to absorb some of that and pop some questions in the Q&A box, I'm very struck, Tim, at the range of recommendations you've come up with. Good to see a list of recommendations. And whilst we wait to see some cues to appear, I was actually going to see if Lucy wanted to come back on for a moment. Thinking particularly of Tim's closing point there of should we be bringing the evaluation and appraisal professional developments closer together? I wondered whether that was something that struck a chord with the ETF. I'm really hoping Lucy's still online. Her name's still on.
Hello. Yeah, I am here. I think that that is kind of what the ETF is doing, in the sense that when we're reviewing business cases that come in from Treasury, we're looking to see the quality of the evidence. My feeling is that where evidence exists, it is used in appraisals. So I don't see a problem that people have done these fantastic evaluations and then the appraisal comes along and the evidence is not used. The problem that I see over and over again is that there is no relevant evidence. So the evidence doesn't exist.
I'm going to come to the online question, but is that because it's there but it wasn't gathered, or is it that we're trying to develop policies in a space where there is no source of evidence that you could draw on?
Yeah, the latter. So
The latter.
the sources of evidence that are available are very limited. Not that there's no evidence, but very limited evidence.
Yeah. Let me go up to anonymous attendee number one. Great presentation. Thanks. Lots to think about. Tim, is a profession really the answer, or do we need to bring the existing professions together better? And have you seen any good examples of where, I think here the question is particularly looking at the evaluation and the appraisal, or the economists and the social scientists. Have you seen examples where those two ways of thinking, those two focuses have been brought together well that you could talk about?
Okay, so I'm not pushing very strongly the idea that one profession. I was floating something there, but I do think there's a worldview gap.
Yeah,
that is a real problem, and I think I simplified that slightly for my talk. So I don't think the worldview gap is clear is simply between evaluation and appraisal, or between economics and social science, or so I think. But I think there is a worldview gap between the kind of the need to take action, quantify things, and say that we understand the world, and then the kind of more theory-based, complexity-sensitive approaches. And I do think those need to come together better to inform decision making. So
couple more
Yeah.
questions coming in.
Yeah, so at its worst, I think you can get a kind of um, an action-orientated false simplicity
Yeah.
sometimes. And then at other times you can get people who are very aware how complex it is, but would struggle to get from there to a recommendation. Um, yeah, go on. Let's go to those questions.
Helen Baxter is going back to the comments you made about the relationship with systems mapping.
Hmm.
And I know you and I have discussed the challenges of when system maps become, 400 factors and a bird's nest
Hmm.
of uselessness. Um, Helen puts it this way: what do you think a good systems map would capture? What would a slimmed down process look like? A process presumably for developing a systems map. Do you have thoughts on that?
So I think there are two things that you might be trying to do, and I think it might be good to distinguish them. So, okay, well, there's one thing that's true about all of it, which is that these things are infinitely complex. So you can't go for understanding the whole thing. At any level, you've got to go for trying to capture the big things that matter. Like, what are the big drivers here that we can get a hold of? But then I think there are two modes. One is kind of understand the system, which is almost a worldview building kind of space that policy teams might engage in. Or the other is around a specific target or a specific decision.
Yeah.
If you can engage around a specific target or a specific decision, that gives you a much better handle on what's relevant or what's proportionate or what's material. Whereas if you don't know that when you're building it, it's very hard to screen stuff out and hold the map
Yeah.
to a sensible scale.
Do you have thoughts? Helen's other part of her question is: do you have any ideas of how you then adjust the system mapping exercise or process to get that beyond your first point, which is, well, have it focused around a specific policy or whatever it is question, as opposed to a generic map of the entire
Yeah.
are there other things that you think that can slim the process down? Um,
Um,
Manageable?
Yeah, I think it's that discipline about constraints at the beginning, and it's the true but useless comment bit I got on my slide, which is it's not about collecting everything that's true or everything that's interesting.
Yeah,
It's about being I think in a government space it's about being really instrumental. What are we actually trying to achieve?
yeah.
What resources have we actually got? And therefore what's relevant to us?
So being prepared to leave stuff out that we all acknowledge is true, but it's not relevant
True,
to this question.
interesting,
Yeah.
but the question is it useful
Yes.
for what we're trying to achieve? And defining what we're trying to achieve clearly at the beginning helps to constrain the exercise, I think.
Yeah. More people saying that this is an important question. I'm seeing more upvotes of this question as we go along. So perhaps if there were some system mappers on the call, and I know there were a few, maybe you can come in with some comment questions or advice thinly veiled as a question that might help us with that question. We have one again from an anonymous attendee. I'm going to read this out. I think there's several bits to this. I often think, since we want to spend resources carefully and ensuring we get value for money as the objective, sometimes doing value for money evaluation using non-economic methods, such as rubric methods, which do not need a counterfactual, are better. What are your thoughts on this? There's a bit more. We'll come back to it in bits. Often CBA or CEA can be more cost intensive if we want a robust evaluation. Do you think we should choose a VFM method which provides better value for money spent on evaluation, or still think of how it would be used for appraisal and therefore switch to a more cost intensive method? Let's break that down a little bit, shall we?
Yeah, yeah.
So it's drawing the distinction between using methods. For example, if you're doing things in government and you have to do a business case and you're taken down the line of doing something that is cost benefit, or it's as you pointed out, I think a multi-utility analysis labeled as a CBA, which are very quantitative, and then you're getting into having to have a quantitative counterfactual. Are there times when doing something that is VFM based, it's non-economic, using rubric methods, when would you go wholly down that sort of area and say, actually, we're not even going to try and do a detailed cost benefit study of this?
Right. So I'm very aware there are people on this call who this is their specialist
Yeah,
subject.
please jump in if this is your
And it,
specialism and I've
and
missed
it, and
everything.
it's not mine,
Yeah.
but I, coming at it from the economic perspective, I do have some views, which is um, one thing is that government will always be interested in value for money.
Mm.
But government's got a limited amount of money. It will want to know it's spending its money well. So you can't ignore value for money. But I'm really against spurious accuracy, as I was saying before. So there's no point in getting super quantitative unless the quantitativity is meaningful. And therefore, it's kind of horses for courses approach. The counterfactual assumes a reasonably strong level of understanding of the system
Yeah.
that you have an idea what would have happened had you not done it. If
Yeah.
you don't have that, there's not a lot of point of doing it with a counterfactual.
Mm.
Um, Cost benefit analysis is only appropriate for certain projects. For some projects, it's not appropriate because there are good reasons why you're doing it, but for lots of technical reasons, you can't capture that benefit in cost benefit analysis. And I would say, for example, nature recovery projects that make ecosystems function properly, they will deliver huge benefits to society.
Yeah.
Some of those are very difficult to quantify, and therefore they end up being invisible on the cost benefit analysis, which is problematic.
Is there then a problem that the the methods that you are squeezed down, particularly in your
Yeah,
world,
yeah,
um, almost try to force you to do a quantitative analysis?
that's true. So there's
Because
two
that's
things.
got an end point that can feed into a decision very clearly, on the one page for the minister or on the impact
Yeah.
assessment page and that kind of thing. And then we'll go to Alan Woodward's question in a minute.
So two things about cost benefit analysis. One is it's a heavily quantitative first model.
Yeah.
So so that could either risk spurious quantification or missing things out.
Yeah.
There are ways of explaining the things that were important that you couldn't capture, but it is difficult. It's also market biased. So it's much easier to put benefits in if they're market benefits or if they're relatively near the market. If your benefits are non-market benefits or some distance from the market or are deeply strategic ones about national security or the natural environment, you can't get them into CBA.
Yeah.
So therefore, yes, I prefer theory-based approaches that say the reason we're spending the money is this is our argument, and then this is our logic chain or theory of change for what we expected to happen as a result of the money, and then demonstrate that we are effectively using good money. We're using the money well, that would seem the right sort of
Yeah.
value for money evaluation for those kind of projects.
Very interesting to hear from anyone on the line who has successfully made that kind of argument through either the arms bodies or through the better regulation unit processes kind of thing, and actually made the argument without the hard CBA at the end. Anonymous attendee, if I butchered your question there, please do come in and clarify it. Alan Woodward, moving on to the next question on the list, has asked, does evaluation and appraisal in public policy both need to work within a known scope of what is possible for government? Does evaluation and appraisal in public policy both need to work? Do they both need to work within a known scope of what is possible for government? That is, to acknowledge some aspects of policy programme intervention will need to be done by other parties, business, community, etc. So acknowledging there is a limit to how far the government element of action can go. And then to weave in the contributions of other people. That must apply in Natural England because you partner with all sorts of other bodies in things that you try to achieve, Tim.
Yeah, so I think that's true. I think that comes back to, I think that helps in terms of defining the appraisal and the evaluation. What is the role for government here? However, I think sometimes we're set up in the Green Book to look for clearly diagnosable market failures in order to justify government intervention. there's some very interesting work by Mariana Mazzucato, who says we're asking the wrong question there. We should ask the question, what outcome do we want to achieve? And therefore, what kind of market and other relationships do we want to achieve that outcome?
Yeah.
So I agree with the question. I think sometimes we limit ourselves too narrowly as to what we think government could do in a
Does
situation.
the regulatory process that you see from where you're sitting in the government, machine, allow you to ask that different question, or does it force you down the first version of the question that you asked?
The green book is still very heavily. So there's a lot that's been under discussion recently and positive changes to the green book. I don't know what will happen, but the green book is still very heavily set up with justification to being about
Right.
clearly defined market failure.
And the government part of that intervention. Yeah.
Yeah. So and the reason for that is to try to hedge against inappropriate government intervention, which is an important concern.
Yeah.
I just think narrowly defined market failure is too narrow a way of defining that.
You've talked, Tim, I'm going back to your introduction at the beginning, that often the appraisal is done against the financial outcomes rather than the actual outcomes of government, the purpose of government, which is to ensure the well-being and health of its people and its environment and everything. Is that also part of what you're saying in terms of asking the wrong question? I've heard you speak about this in other contexts.
So, well, it comes back to what I was saying in terms of I think it helps the evaluation and appraisal if we can focus on longer term, more stable outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
So I was focusing on, and it's good to focus on the final outcomes as far as we can do. So I'd suggested health, well-being, nature, and sustainability as some outcomes that we're likely to be working towards under different governments. There will be others as well, but that helps with the comparison between projects, the more that we can link it to long-term outcomes.
Just to finish the last bit of what's in Alan Woodward's question, where then do we see the space for bringing in, how the other parties will contribute into the mix that eventually makes the government decision?
So the Barber Review of Public Expenditure very much encouraged government bodies to engage outside government with interested parties and experts around these conversations around evidence-based, what actions would lead to what change, etc.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of on record as best practice. Yeah.
Okay. Another anonymous attendee question here. Going back to the system mapping question, if you flip your head back to your system mapping points, have you seen any examples of system mapping being used really well to communicate the impact of a program or a policy? What's the key to providing weight behind this kind of evidence compared to other methods? This is something that I've heard you speak about, Tim, about the difference between mapping for our own understanding and mapping as a tool of communication. Have you seen really good examples?
I think no.
You haven't seen any really good examples.
I'm not sure. I don't, and I'm wondering whether it would work. I think to date, I think system mapping has largely been used where the people who help develop the map are the people that benefit most from it. So it's really helpful in terms of building a shared understanding amongst the people in the room, both in terms of them understanding each other and themselves. But it's not a communication vic. I think you could use it to support communication.
Yeah.
If you had that shared understanding, you could then start to build stories that connected to the map and what had actually happened. But they tend to be pretty intimidating to the people, either people who are not experts in that field or people who didn't help create them.
So
So
the
I
simple,
think
simple
they could
answer
have
is
been a
no, you
supporting
haven't.
role, but I can't see them as a communications tool.
Uh,
Yeah.
there's about 10 minutes left if people who do system mapping and have used it for fantastic communication in government want to leap on and
Okay,
put a
good, good, good,
question in,
good.
which is actually a thinly veiled recommendation to go and look at something. Phil, give us the good examples. But it is something that people in this CECAN community have talked about a lot, about the difference between system mapping for the understanding of those who are drawing up the policy or drawing up the
Yeah.
case for change versus using it to tell somebody else why a policy might work, explaining parts of
Yeah.
the story and the narratives, which is often recommended, but as you say, is not as common as we might hope it would be.
Yeah.
I am short on questions in the online pad. We have a few minutes left. Um, can I take you back for a minute while we leave that open? I'll come back to that question in a minute, just to say you had this thing about broadening CECAN's mission, and a lot of the CECAN connected people are online here. Um, I don't want you to speak to that in a minute. I'm going to come back to Andrew Darnton's question in just a moment. But what were you pitching at there with broadening CECAN's mission?
Okay, so there's two things here that I welcome, but I'm worried that they won't be sustainable. So one is there's a sort of boom in evaluation in government. So some people have made a really good job of making the case for evaluation. Governments kind of buy into that. But it's got to be used and seen to be useful to sustain that boom in evaluation. And secondly, I think there's a lot of really interesting work going on about complexity of the systems thinking. Both things I'm really keen on. Again, we kind of need to cache them and convince people that are not natural allies that those are useful to kind of sustain that. So where that was coming from was how these things connect into, I think a lot of them have been used in kind of worldview building. So helping policy teams understand that the world that they're in and forming a shared understanding. I think we should keep doing that. I think it's really important. But I think to justify its continuation, we've got to show how to make the connections into
Yeah,
value for money decision making and appraisal.
yeah,
So that's where that was. So, I mean, whether CCAN should really change what it's doing or not is not up to me at all. I'm being provocative, but I think that there is a gap there in terms of the rubber hitting the road with this
yeah.
stuff.
There's a feeling in what you're saying that we're getting a certain amount out of the wringing out the rag of evaluation, but there's more in there that we could get out of this if we took a
Yeah.
slightly wider view of it. Oh, now we've got a flurry of questions. So, Andrew Darnton's question. I heard you say, Tim, that policy leads and evaluation then follows. Evaluation set free, which is the first time I've heard that phrase, Andrew, can generate extensive learning. Should we not be redesigning the policy process profession so that it can accommodate what's learned rather than demanding evaluators deliver more definitive evidence of policy impact? I think this is taking a slightly wider view of what we might take away from any particular evaluation.
Yeah, I think I agree with that, or at least what we want is a really helpful, constructive conversation between policy and all these different specialisms.
Yeah.
It also speaks slightly to the question we had earlier about whether there is any evidence at all. And I think sometimes that might depend on the bar that we set or what counts as evidence
Yeah.
when we're deciding what to do. There's very rarely a total vacuum. I think it's
Yeah.
often that we've set a bar which is higher than what we've got.
There's a comment just come in there, or question from Helen Baxter saying, which I think is related to this. There's an issue here with that we don't connect to the past evaluations more effectively with current evaluations and draw on stuff we learnt, maybe not from something we did exactly the same, but something that has some similarities and draw that forwards. Everything is sort of very often a start as new. I'm not sure that's always true. I've certainly talked with people about some evaluations and they've said, oh, we should look at this one and this one. But I don't think it's very common that we look back at previous evaluations. What's your experience, Tim?
So I don't know that, but it does seem to me that the what work centers are really critical in terms of pulling together what we
Yeah,
learn and synthesizing it. that seems to be necessary for most appraisals to be able to pick up on what's going on, because they're not going to have time to do the synthesis themselves. See, the other thing I worry about is that, in a way, being complexity sensitive can make you less, almost less effective at arguing your case for funding. Because the danger is that the people who are most successful at arguing the case are the ones who are super confident about what they're doing.
Say it's absolutely simple. Here's the number.
And they might be super confident
Cost benefit of 35 to 1, off we go.
because they've screened out the complexity.
Yeah.
And the people who are more aware of the complexity might be less confident. So there is a danger of a kind of perverse outcome there, where the less aware you are of the complexity, the more confident you are, or stroke appear. So
you're almost in Dunning-Kruger territory, Tim, of just enough to sound confident about it, but not enough to realize that actually it's far more complicated than that.
So there was a government exercise called value mapping, where departments were sort of rating their own confidence and their own expenditure. And I did wonder in that exercise, well, there was a risk with that exercise that the reports that went back into Treasury were based on each department's level of confidence in their expenditure, which may not have been the same thing as, well, it may have been entirely subjective, depending on their worldview.
If you're invited to compress everything down to a one-pager for the minister, it can be challenging to capture complexity meaningfully in that. And in fact, that the very fact that you have reduced it to one page may suggest it's simpler than it really is, perhaps. A comment here just for information, and then I'll go to Vanessa's question, which we'll have time for maybe one more after that. Not a question, just an observation that the Scottish government recently launched a new centre of expertise in appraisal and evaluation, bringing those two things together, as was in one of your recommendations, Tim. With these challenges in mind, perhaps this is the kind of approach should be adopted more widely. I'm sure the evaluation task force and whoever runs the Green Book in the Treasury will be watching the Scottish government carefully and inquiring as to what difference that makes. Thank you very much to some person who popped that in. Vanessa asks, can you elaborate more on the use of risk opportunity analysis? Is this something that central government would appreciate and value more if it can't conduct a robust CBA, CEA? I think put that question to you, Tim, if anybody from central ministerial governments, as opposed to the outer spiral arms of Natural England, would like to also answer that. Would it be appreciated? Would it find an audience, do you think?
So I think DESNES are particularly interested because they have a transformational remit. And if your job is to, for example, change the energy system so that we get towards net zero, then cost benefit analysis is not the appropriate appraisal mechanism, because cost benefit analysis would show it as cheaper to stick with what we were currently doing. For example, there's a conservative bias in cost benefit analysis towards the system that you've already got. So if your role is transformational, you want a different appraisal system, and I think that is the case that's being made for risk and opportunity analysis.
So that also apply to somewhere like DSIT, the science and technology people, or those kinds of areas you picked on.
Yeah, I think it could apply to. I think it could apply to lots of areas where one of two things was going on. One is where the government task was transformational, or where in the environmental sector, for example, where change is coming fast, whether we like it or not.
Would it make it through Treasury, do you think? Or maybe that might be a comment for others to respond to.
Yeah, I don't know. We'll watch. But cost benefit analysis assumes that you're making a change which is marginal to the system that you're dealing with, and that the system is reasonably stable. And where those two things are true, then it makes a lot of sense. But if they're not true,
but the system is highly reactive. or you're making a vast change.
Or your system, or your change that you're making is large compared to the scale of the system.
Yeah.
Then you want a more complexity sensitive appraisal mechanism. And risk opportunity is that, and it's under development. Yeah.
We're at 12:25. I'm going to tell you what's happening next, people. Thank you so much to Tim for your insightful input and your thought-provoking inputs to us, and for those who've popped questions in on that.